Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming to Chayei Moharan. It's actually Shiur 26 of this series, but we'll give a quick recap in case you are not on track with where we're holding. This is actually the first one we're doing live, like in person, so that's pretty exciting. Usually I have my audience here if they're watching on Spotify or YouTube or Instagram Live, so wherever you're coming from, thanks so much for joining. As a reminder, as I say before I start each year, these are in memory of my maternal grandparents, Menachem ben David Tzvi and Alana bas Sarah. May our learning bring their neshamas the highest of aliyahs. So, for those who are new to this series and have not heard the shiur prior, this is the 25th version of this shiur, well, not version, like episode or whatever we want to call it, where we've been exploring the different sections of the Sefer Chayei Moharan, which talks about the life and the teachings and some of the stories of the life of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. So the past 25 shiurim, we dealt with the introduction and the sections that dealt with Rabbi Nachman's life and his upbringing and many of his travels. And we've now reached a new section in the Sefer where we deal with Rabbi Nachman's trip to the land of Israel. And what was the significance? Why did he go? It's a story that's clouded in a lot of mystery. There's a lot of really peculiar things and events that happen along the way. But nevertheless, it's filled with practical wisdom and guidance and something really deep. So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. And what can we learn from Rabbi Nachman's travels, some of his decisions, some of his risks, and his willingness to move into the unknown. So I also wanted to connect what we're learning tonight to the Chassidic holiday of Yud Tes Kislev. It's the 19th day of the month of Kislev, which is coming up this coming week in about, less than 10 days, 9 days now. And that holiday celebrates the day that the Alter Rebbe of Lubavitch, the first Chabad Rebbe, he was released from prison. And one of the main reasons he was put in prison in the first place was because of this conspiracy that, I love conspiracies, right? So one of the reasons was that there was a group of people who were against the teachings of chassidut, known as the Misnagdim. And one of the things they did is they reported to the police and told the Russians that the Alter Rebbe was giving money to the Turks, the Ottomans, who were in control of Israel, which at the time, historically, the Russians and the Turks, they have a long history of being against each other, but at that time they were still enemies. And the Alter Rebbe giving money to Israel, which was under the rule of the Turks, that was against the law in Russia, and therefore that was one of the reasons he was put in prison. Obviously, the spiritual reason was because he was teaching chassidut, but another big reason was that he was actually distributing money and funds. And I'm going to hopefully try find a connection between what we're going to learn here in Chayei Moharan and Rabbi Nachman's beginning trip to Israel and Yud Tes Kislev. See if we can make a connection because of the time of year we're in. Interestingly, when Rabbi Nachman traveled in 1798, he was 26 years old, and we're now doing our 26th year. I just found that pretty cool. So, yeah. So, let us begin. I should also mention that Yud Tes Kislev was one of the reasons why I actually wanted to start this whole shiur series in the first place. So it's coming up on a year of when I wanted to start this series. If you go 52 divided by 2, that's 26. So we didn't do 52 full shiurim in this year because life can sometimes get busy, but nevertheless, that's where we're holding. So we're going to start with source number 1 on the top of your sheets, which comes from the Sefer of Chayei Moharan. If anyone's looking inside here, we're on page Kuf Samach. And if you're looking inside in the English here, we're on page 68. So, top of your sources in Chayei Moharan. Oh, okay, that's okay. I'm going to translate it in English, so that's fine. Yeah, no need. Okay. So this Sefer here is actually written by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Rabbi Nachman's main student. And he actually came into the picture way after Rabbi Nachman had already come back from Israel. But nevertheless, he went back spoke to many of his Rabbi Nachman's students and collected all these writings and stories and put them into this book. So we have him to thank, because if not for him, none of this would have survived. So Reb Nosson writes in here, V'nishma mipiv HaKodesh, kodem nesiyasem medvedevka l'Eretz Yisrael b'mei Chag HaPesach. Rabbi Nachman was heard to say around the time that he was in the city of Medvedevka. As we know, Rabbi Nachman had done many, many trips in his life, and he settled in a place called Medvedevka for a large majority of time. And he was saying at this time around this holiday of Pesach that year, which was 1798, that he wanted to travel to Israel. And he was heard saying that many, many times. Shamar Shiur writes a lisa l'Eretz Yisrael, Kedei l'kayim sham kol hatayr mitzvos. He wanted to be able to travel to Israel. One of the reasons was to actually be able to accomplish and to fulfill all the 613 mitzvahs. As it's known, not all the mitzvahs that we have today can be accomplished outside of the land of Israel. A lot of them actually need to be done only in Israel. Additionally, 244 commandments cannot be done actually today, whether you're in Israel or outside of Israel, just because of not having the Beit HaMikdash, we can't accomplish them today. So there's some mitzvahs that just can't be done. Obviously, on a spiritual level, when we're saying karbonot before shacharis or mincha, that's a way of being able to fulfill the karbonos, but still we can't fulfill them all physically today. So something very interesting, though, in the brackets here, Reb Nosson, or at least who the editor, wrote Hashesh Meos Ushloishe Esreis. He actually wrote out the numbers instead of saying Taryag, which is known as an acronym for all the mitzvahs. Nevertheless, Lichlol Yachad Kol HaMitzvahs Hataluis Ba'aretz Im Kol HaMitzvahs Shalchutz La'aretz L'chloilam Yachad Elokaimim Baruchnias Va'achar Kach Yuchal L'kaimim Karoi B'Gashmias. So on a deeper level, what did Rabbi Nachman want to do with all the mitzvahs? He wanted to take all the mitzvahs and combine them. So he'd take the ones from outside of the land of Israel, and he'd take the ones that he's already fulfilled in his life on a spiritual level, and then he'd travel to Israel, and he'd want to fulfill all the mitzvahs that he could in the land of Israel on a spiritual level, but then also combine all of them together to be able to fulfill them all on a physical level. So once he's done those all with the meditations and the practice and the right intentions, he'd be able to combine all the mitzvahs and it'd be as if he'd completed them all. Ovechol elu, and with all of these, elu advarim yesh sichos v'sipurim haribe kamuvan mahanashim shesipur zayis lefonai. And with all these things that he's said and all the stories about traveling to Israel and to accomplish all these things, kamuvan mahanashim shesipur zayis lefonai achanochi lo hayisi b'chol zeh. So Reb Nosson is writing this small little section here, and he's saying that all the stories and all the talks and all the conversations regarding Rabbi Nachman wanting to travel to Israel, he had all heard them from other people. So he's saying that all that he's included here, and he's writing in this account, that not all of them we're obviously going to see today because they're in several pages and chapters. Rabbi Nosson was not able to include them all because they were unfortunately lost with time, but he tried to include as many as he can, and hopefully in the next coming weeks we'll also get to some of those. But we're going to also take the time tonight to be able to at least look at a few of them, especially the idea of being able to fill all the 613 mitzvahs in the Israel and out, and we'll see that outside in a minute. Continuing on, though, in the Sefer, says Reb Nosson, Va'amar, Shegam mitam zeh hu noisa li Eretz Yisrael, one of the reasons that Rabbi Nachman wanted to travel to Eretz Yisrael had to do with his grandfather, known as Rabbi Nachman Horadenker, Hashocha Eretz Yisrael, who actually lived in Israel. Rabbi Nachman Horadenker was one of the main students of the Baal Shem Tov, and he had a son. He had a son, Simcha, and Simcha was Rabbi Nachman's father. So that's how he connects to that. Rabbi Nachman's mother was Fega, who was the daughter of Odel, who was the daughter of the Baal Shem Tov. So Rabbi Nachman is a direct line from the Baal Shem Tov. So it's a short little genealogical point. But Rabbi Nachman was in great contact with his grandfather, Rabbi Nachman Horadenker, who he's named after, and he would send many letters and correspondence, and he was very, very close with him. And the way he would do that, Haya sholeach es hatzadik Rabbi Yeshaya Zal hashoicha b'misela. So there was a guy named, well, it wasn't just a guy, his name was Rabbi Yeshaya Miyanov, and he was a student also of the Baal Shem Tov. And Rabbi Yeshaya and Rabbi Nachman, as in his Rabbi Nachman's grandfather, both moved to Eretz Yisrael at a time with a great rabbi named Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Vitebsk. And they all moved together in a pack of like 300 chassidim. And truthfully, the Aliyah associations won't really say this, but they're one of the first groups of people to actually make Aliyah. They were the first chassidim, if we can call them that, chassidish chassidim. Yeah. So this was 300 chassidim that moved, and two of these people happened to be Rabbi Nachman's grandfather and Rabbi Yeshaya. And whenever Rabbi Nachman wanted to be in contact with his grandfather, he'd send letters to Rabbi Yeshaya. Rabbi Yeshaya would send it to Rabbi Nachman Horadenker, and then he'd receive the correspondence back. So it's just a way of like securely being able to send letters. But since this Rabbi Yeshaya had actually passed away, he was unable to be able to contact his grandfather directly for whatever reason. So therefore, Rabbi Nachman insisted that he actually had to go himself and deliver the letters and be able to correspond with his grandfather without any sort of middleman. So that was another main reason why he felt he had to go to Eretz Yisrael. So he's saying, since he couldn't send them with Rabbi Shaya, so therefore he went to Israel to be able to speak with his grandfather. So therefore, to be able to receive the knowledge and the answers that he wanted to his questions, he felt he had to go himself. And that was another reason why he went. So firstly, we have the 613 mitzvahs, and we have that he needed to correspond with his grandfather. Ukfi hanishma, and furthermore, some ideas that he was also heard saying, Shahayu loikama v'kama tamim be'inyan nisiyasei la'eretz Yisrael milvad hanistar shalagi laklal. There were many other reasons that Rabbi Nachman also felt he needed to go to Eretz Yisrael. Some of them we might see later on in this series of Shiurim. But there were a lot, truthfully, as this is really common with Rabbi Nachman. A lot of them were hidden and secretive, and he didn't disclose all of them to his students or even to his closest family or his attendants. Because as it's known with Rabbi Nachman, he didn't just do things for only one reason. There were many reasons as to why he did some stuff. And we saw some of them actually already. There were places where he went, like he traveled to Lemberg, and he never told people why he traveled to Lemberg. I believe it was last week's Shiur, and also the week before that, where he was traveling, and he said he had to go to a certain city, and it was, I believe it was Kamenetz, and he even had a dream where he was speaking to his great-grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, where he had appeared to him and told him he had to go to the city, but he never revealed to anyone why he actually went to that city. Some of them believe that there was a great tzaddik named Adam Baal Shem, and his documents and his manuscripts were hidden in this city, so perhaps he had to go to retrieve them, but it's never really confirmed that this is exactly why Rabbi Nachman had to travel. So there's many, many reasons, a lot of them are hidden, as to why Rabbi Nachman did one single thing. Rak b'chol davar she'asa hayu boi kama v'kama alafim v'rivois ta'amim elyonim amukim ugvohim ma'oy ma'oid. Each thing that Rabbi Nachman did was filled with thousands and numerous of really deep reasons. U'befrat ha'nis'iyah le'eretz Yisrael, especially his trip to Eretz Yisrael, shemasar nafshay al zeh ma'oid ma'oid b'li shir v'erech k'mavayar kfar. Saying has already been explained, but we're also going to see this later on, that Rabbi Nachman really did almost give up his life to be able to get to Eretz Yisrael. Interestingly, as soon as he reached the shores of Jaffa, he told his attendant, okay, we can go now. And his attendant's like, what do you mean? We've traveled, we've risked our lives practically in great storms, and you're going to tell me we're going to leave? We just got here. So they decided to stay, and Rabbi Nachman accomplished more things. One of them I'll touch on tonight as well. So that is Chayei Moharan, but I feel like we have to break down a little bit because it seems like there's more to uncover here. So some key points that we can take away from what we just learned. Firstly, Rabbi Nachman, he wanted to fulfill all 613 mitzvahs, as we said. There's the mitzvahs that especially have to do with the land that you can't actually do outside of the land of Israel. So that's some of them that you could accomplish. What he wanted to do was spiritually to be able to fulfill them, and then physically also be able to fulfill those mitzvahs. And then obviously to be able to connect with his grandfather because of his messenger having passed away. So, on a spiritual level, anyone who watches these shiurim already know that I try to make practical anything that we're learning. So it's not just, we're learning about Rabbi Nachman's life and then we just we walk away just knowing some of the story. How can we try and actually physically apply something that we're learning from his life into our lives? And that's usually my goal with this. So a friend of mine, I don't know if he's watching here tonight, but he shared with me a really short lesson from Rabbi Nachman's main magnum opus called Chayei Moharan. And it was literally it's a one-liner. It's really, really short. But last week I was talking about when you're struggling or you feel like you're down and you don't know how to pick yourself up, that you literally just have to move your feet. It's simple as that. Even if you don't feel like you want to move it, you just have to move. And Rabbi Nachman said that, he kept talking about just wanting to move and just wanting to go to Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, maybe we can try and find some sort of practical application to that before we learn a little bit more about the mitzvahs. So let's treat this as a bit of a quick segue. So in Chayei Moharan 198, and it's that first section of Rabbi Nachman's Magna Opus, he writes as follows: Kishe'echad soek la'Hashem yisbarach, when someone screams out to Hashem, Oimrim lo lisa, they tell him to move. K'moshe Kislev, as it says in Parshas Shmos in Exodus, Ma titzak elai daber el bnei Yisrael vayisau. Hashem says to Moshe, why are you crying out to me? Speak to the children of Israel and tell them to start moving. So historically, what's happening when this is taking place? The famous scene happens when the Jewish people have arrived at the Red Sea. They're being chased. Parah is behind them. The Egyptians are behind them. And now they're stuck and they're literally sandwiched between the sea and the Egyptians, and there's nowhere to go. So the people cry out to Moshe and say, what are we supposed to do? Should we go back to Egypt? Do we run into the sea? What do we do? And Moshe was like, I'm not really sure here. So he turns to Hashem, and then Hashem says, why are you crying out to me? Just tell them to move. So that's a bit of a background for what's going on there. But Moshe, he really enters tefillah mode, and he cries out to Hashem, and Hashem responds literally that this is not the time to be crying out. There's a time for crying out, and there's a time for action. And right now is the time for action, and you actually have to take a step and just move. So I feel like, I can speak for myself, that there's many times in my life where it's like, is this a time for crying out? Is this a time for struggle and reaching out to people? But sometimes those moments when you're in that is actually a time for just movement rather than thought and introspection. So this is exactly what Rabbi Nachman is teaching us in this really short lesson, that now you have to just take that first step and open that door and just go through it. And I feel like this is exactly what Rabbi Nachman did to be able to start off his journey. He didn't just yearn for the land. He made the plans and he just went. And he didn't just cry out for clarity. He traveled to be able to accomplish the things that he wanted to do. And he didn't just daven for the action. He was very, very much active to be able to make the things that he needed to do happen. Even to the point where this will be touched on more in the Sefer. And we've already mentioned it in one of our previous shiurim, that Rabbi Nachman even went to really, really low places to be able to actively get to where he needed to go. And there's a contrast between the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov attempted to go to the land of Israel, but famously never made it. And Rabbi Nachman, his great-grandson, did the same thing, pretty much followed in a very similar path, and he made it. So the question is, why did Rabbi Nachman make it, and why did the Baal Shem Tov not make it? And Rabbi Nachman famously explains that he was willing to go to really low places, even hide himself as a chassid and a tzaddik, to the point where he was almost irrecognizable. People couldn't tell that this was Rabbi Nachman. He was acting also in really strange ways that would be out of character for a Rebbe of his stature. And he said he was willing to go to those low places in order that he would not have any spiritual impact from negative forces, that the Baal Shem Tov was not able to go to those low places, and that's how he was able to reach the land of Israel. So another point of Rabbi Nachman just willing to go to the places where he needed to go to be able to get to his destinations. So let's learn a little bit of the 613 mitzvahs and the difference between accomplishing them in Israel and outside of Israel, so we can understand to the best of our knowledge of perhaps why one of the reasons Rabbi Nachman wanted to go to the land. So we begin in the second source that you have on your sheets. This is from Sefer Vayikra. We're going to see two sources here. One is Sefer Vayikra. We're also going to see Sefer Devarim, but two main commentaries of the Ramban and the Sifrei who discuss this concept of fulfilling mitzvahs inside of Israel and outside, and what's the difference, and whether or not we're actually doing any mitzvahs by just living here in Toronto or New York or wherever we're from. So, says the Ramban, actually, one second. First, we're going to see the Pesukim. Sorry about that. So, in Vayikra, verse 25, this is in chapter 18, writes there, "V'titma haaretz ve'efkod avoina aleha v'taki haaretz es yoshvea." The land became defiled, and I called it to account for its iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants. And the next pasuk reads, "Shmartem atem es chukaisai ve'es mishpatai v'lo yisasu mikol ha'to'evos ha'ela ha'ezrach v'hager hagar b'socham." Hashem says that the condition of the land not spewing out its inhabitants and making sure that the Jews can stay in their land is that if you follow all of the rules and the laws that Hashem has given you, and you do not make these things like abhorrent or nothing in your eyes, then no citizen, no stranger who rides among you is going to be able to affect you. The next pasuk we also have is from Devarim, which says, "Besamtem es devarei ela al levavchem v'al nafshechem," that you should place all these things on your heart and on your soul. That's a famous pasuk that we say every day in Shema. So let's examine these three pasukim. So the Rambam, just on the outside, he explains that the land of Israel, that when we're doing mitzvahs outside of the land of Israel, like in New York or Thornhill or Florida, these are actually just practice where we're perfecting the action of the mitzvahs. So once we eventually gather as a tribe back in the land of Israel, we'll know how to do them. So this is all just practice. We're not actually fulfilling them, and only once we get to the land of Israel are we fulfilling them. This is actually, luckily, not the halacha. We actually do accomplish them, but that's a spoiler. But still, the primary place, though, and the first spiritual effect, he says, is actually in Israel. And the relationship with Hashem that we have here is directed only through the land. So everything we have here is all practice. And our chachamim, on that, they say that one who lives outside the land of Israel as if he has no God. And that is not supposed to be taken literally. It's just more saying that one lacks a direct, deep connection if we're not in the land of Israel, where that is highly concentrated. And this is exactly why perhaps Rabbi Nachman wanted to travel to the land of Israel to be able to fulfill all those mitzvahs that you either are considered practice according to the Ramban, or so you could actually also fulfill the lands the mitzvahs that can't be fulfilled where he was in the Ukraine, what is now the Ukraine. So, connecting onto that is the Sifrei, who says the following. So we're going to see that part inside. So he says, "V'samtem es devarei ela al levavchem." So what does this pasuk mean? "And you shall place these words upon your hearts and upon your souls." He says this refers to Torah. This refers to study. That when you're studying the Torah, this is exactly what the translation of this pasuk means. That you should place these words upon your heart and upon your soul. So you should be living with these words that you're learning. And what's the next part of the pasuk? The next part of the verse, "Ukshartem osam lo'os al yedchem," that you should tie these onto your sign. This should be a sign for your your hands and for your eyes. He's saying, "En li ela tefillin v'talmud Torah." This is referring to the wrapping of tefillin and to Torah study. So, shar mitzvahs shebetorah menayin. So, if the first part of the verse was referring to the Torah study, and the second part of the verse is referring to tefillin and to the study of Torah, then where do I know the same for other mitzvahs? Where are other mitzvahs hinted to in the Torah? Harei ata dan mibinyan av shebein shnehem. So there's a concept called a binyan av, which takes two different things in the Torah, and they find a common denominator in between them, so we can learn something out from them. So this is exactly where we're going to learn the following. So, one second. So what's this common denominator that we're finding? Loi ra'i tefillin karoi Talmud Torah v'loi ra'i Talmud Torah karoi tefillin. So tefillin is not exactly like Torah study, and Torah study is not exactly like tefillin. Obviously that's a pretty clear statement. Then when we're tying our tefillin, we're not doing the same action as Torah study and vice versa. But what is their common denominator? Hatzad hashava shebehem shehem mitzvahs haguf she'ein tluis ba'aretz v'nehegetz ba'aretz v'chutz la'aretz kach. So the common denominator is that they're mitzvahs pertaining to the body, which are not contingent upon the land. Kol mitzvahs haguf she'ein tluis ba'aretz nehegetz ba'aretz v'chutz la'aretz v'shetluya ba'aretz and nehegetz ela ba'aretz. And then they obtain both in Israel and outside of it. So all mitzvahs pertain to the body, which are not contingent upon the land, obtain both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of it. So, just saying this on the outside, there are some mitzvahs which are dependent upon living in the land of Israel, and there are some mitzvahs which are not dependent on living in the land of Israel, and vice versa. And that is the common denominator between some mitzvahs being not like Torah study and tefillin not being exactly like Torah study. So that's something that's common in both these psukim here. So I don't think we need to continue the rest, but there's other laws that are also said here that some can be only done in Israel, such as Arla and Kilayim. And then there's another law called Chadash, which new produce is not allowed to be used right away, and that is actually a law of the land that also applies outside the land of Israel. So on the outside, that was a little bit fast and a little bit complicated, so just so we can fully understand that. On that pasuk that we saw in Devarim earlier, we learned that tefillin and Torah are mitzvahs of the body that apply both in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and outside of it. And from there we derive that all bodily mitzvahs that are done by our bodies and physically acted upon actually apply everywhere. And while land-dependent mitzvahs apply only in the land, except for Chadash, which was the new produce. That was a different one. So the same Midrashic tradition also emphasized that we keep mitzvahs in exile so that when we return, they won't be new to us. So there's the idea of practice, like the Ramban said, but you do actually accomplish them. But then also when we get into Israel, not only are they going to be really easy for us to do because we've been doing them our entire lives, but then it also reaches that higher level because it's spiritually concentrated in the land. So now Rabbi Nachman, touching back to Rabbi Nachman's journey, because this is what this whole Shiur is about, this is the ultimate expression of being able to unify past mitzvahs that he had done, present mitzvahs that he was doing, and future mitzvahs, because he had already been in the land of Israel. He tasted that holiness, so then future mitzvahs, he's also going to be able to tap into that Eretz Yisrael energy that he had during his trip to be able to actually accomplish them. So that's what it means to be able to take mitzvahs on a physical level, combine them with the spiritual, and then take the land of Israel mitzvahs, the outside of Israel mitzvahs, and put them all together as a combination. And that's what we mentioned in the first paragraph of what we learned tonight. Interestingly, the Nitziv, that's Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He was a 9th century scholar from the yeshiva of Volozhin. 8th?
No, 19th.
19th?
Right? Not 9th century.
Oh, you could be right. Yeah.
He's contemporary, right?
That's true. Good point. Thank you for that. Yeah. So he adds that even rational mitzvahs, bein adam l'chavera, between man and fellow man, achieve greater significance in the land of Israel. So, Avos Yisrael, not speaking lashon hara, evil talk, those sort of things are even higher when accomplished in the land of Israel. Nevertheless, obviously, those are really important for us to keep outside of the land as well. And he said, so, on that point, one of these goals for Rabbi Nachman, while not explicitly mentioned here, but I'm going to hopefully connect it tonight, was to actually bridge this gap between chassidim in Europe and chassidim in Eretz Yisrael. So that, for me, is the segue from now that we're learning about the 613 mitzvahs, and I feel like we've narrowed that down to exactly what Rabbi Nachman's intention was, that we can now find a segue from the 613 mitzvahs to how Yud Tes Kislev, the Hasidic holiday, is connected to Rabbi Nachman's trip in 1798. And that, for me, is the point we're saying that mitzvahs between man and each other, importantly, Avos Yisrael, finding love between our fellow man, is one of the things Rabbi Nachman actually wanted to accomplish there. So that leads to the next point, which we're hopefully going to uncover now. So, as I mentioned before, there was a great scholar, a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the second leader of the Hasidic movement after the Baal Shem Tov had passed away. And in 1777, he led a trip of 300 Hasidim, as I mentioned, to the land of Israel, and they were the first pioneers into the land and settled in Tzfat and in Tiberia. And once Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk had passed away, a Rebbe by the name of Avram of Kalisk took over. Rabbi Avram of Kalisk was also a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, but he began his journey into chassidut actually from the students of the Vilna Gaon. He was a direct student of the Vilna Gaon, and then found chassidut, was really captured by it, and eventually became the main leader of the Hasidic movement in the land of Israel after his predecessor, Rabbi Nachman Mendel Vitebsk, had passed away. So, in Europe, we have all these different Hasidic Rebbes at the time, some of them being Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. There were a lot of different schools of thought spread out, obviously from Mezrich, but outwards to Ukraine and Poland and Russia. And one of the main ones was the Alter Rebbe, as we know. He was actually supposed to go on the trip of the 300 Hasidim, and he was going to actually settle in Israel. And at the last moment, he actually decided to turn back because he felt he had more to accomplish in Europe, and he felt he had students and people who relied on him. And he felt that also by financially supporting all the Jews in Israel through Europe and collecting money and sending to them, that he'd also have a portion in their settlement. But he felt that he was the man for the job because someone needed to support them, because at the time in Israel, there were limited jobs, poverty was pretty high, there was famine, obviously the land was not very settled and people were spread out across the place, so to be able to have some sort of financial support from Europe really meant a lot. So the Alter Rebbe and Rabbi Nachman Mendel Vitebsk set up a fund called the Chalukah. It's actually still around today. It's now known as Kolel Chabad. If you go to Yerushalayim, and we've been there several times, where you can go up the steps from the Kotel, and there's actually a Kolel Chabad building, like literally in the heart of the old city. And that was set up by the Alter Rebbe as a fund to be able to support the Hasidim in Israel. But once Rabbi Nachman Mendel had passed away, there were some communication issues. Obviously, because of the distance, you can imagine what it was like to be able to communicate and write letters and wait months for that to arrive. And on a deep spiritual level, Rabbi Nachman actually says that when there's conflict between tzaddikim on our level, we should not get involved in those because it's happening way above our understanding. But there was a disagreement between Rabbi Avram of Kalisk and the Alter Rebbe. Some of them were ideological, but some of them also, I think, from my understanding, it was to do with the collection of funds. So what Rabbi Nachman did was, on his trip to the land of Israel, he had promised the Alter Rebbe that one of the things he was going to do was to meet with the Chassidim of Israel and try bridge the gap between them and make shalom between him and the Alter Rebbe. So when he went back, there wouldn't be any more disagreements between the two schools of thought and within the movement itself. Obviously, you can imagine chassidus, even in the beginning, had a lot of opposition. And then some of the students of the Vilna Gaon, after the chassidim had moved to Israel, also had a group of people who moved to Israel and settled in Yerushalayim, and the chassidim were in Tveria and Sfat. So there was already this divide within Judaism, and Rabbi Nachman wanted to try and make peace as much as he could within that. So that was another really big reason why Rabbi Nachman wanted to travel to Israel and to make peace. And that's that connection between Adam Lechavero that applies both in Israel and in outside in the diaspora. And that was one of the things Rabbi Nachman tried to do. And that is our connection between Yud Tes Kislev, which was Rabbi Nachman, the Alter Rebbe being put in prison for the distribution of funds to the land of Israel, and Rabbi Nachman trying to make peace so that the funds would flow and there'd be a mutual understanding between the chassidim of Europe and in Israel. So if not for Rabbi Nachman, then there would still be that disagreement. But then he came to make peace with that. So interestingly, as soon as Rabbi Nachman came back from Israel, which obviously we'll be covering in several weeks in the Sefer itself, but just from the outside, the first place he wanted to go once he was back in Europe was actually to visit the Alter Rebbe in Liadi. We actually did cover. It was written like in real, like very, very short, but it was mentioned here in towards the beginning of the Sefer that's what happened, because obviously Rabbi Nachman was 27 years old, but he met the Alter Rebbe then, and then he had a second meeting with the Alter Rebbe in 1810 before the Alter Rebbe had before he passed away. So there was this mutual connection between them. And obviously, one of the first things he did once he came back to Israel was to report to the Alter Rebbe that indeed we can begin to make peace between the two factions in Israel and outside. And a promise they actually made to each other because of their mutual connection was that one day they'd become mishpacha, they'd become family, and the Alter Rebbe's grandson his name was Aaron, and once both Rebbes had passed away, the Alter Rebbe's grandson Aaron married Rabbi Nachman's daughter Chaya. So indeed, they actually did become mishpacha, and that dream and bracha actually did come true. So that's just a beautiful, end to that story. So I think something I feel we can learn from these two meetings is that two different paths of chassidus can meet, and they can bless each other, and they can have mutual respect and mutual connection, and that achdus, unity, doesn't require sameness. You can have unity, you can have connection, you can have brotherly love between each other, and we don't have to be the same. We shouldn't be the same. We should be our own unique individuals and still come together and be able to get along harmoniously. So just to wrap up, we had several questions in the beginning that we wanted to cover, and just want to make sure that we outline them to show that we answered them. So firstly, how is Yud Tes Kislev relevant to Rabbi Nachman? We show that Yud Tes Kislev marks the Alter Rebbe's release from prison after being arrested for supporting chassidim in Israel, and that Rabbi Nachman's journey to Israel acted as a peacemaking role between the Alter Rebbe and the leaders in Israel, and that there's the struggle and survival of chassidus rooted in the land was now in safe hands. We showed that the Alter Rebbe's arrest was connected to Rabbi Nachman's trip, and that what was happening in the Jewish world tied these stories together. And we also showed that Rabbi Nachman was trying to not only repair himself in the Hasidic world, but also in the upper worlds in himself with deeper clarity and connecting himself to the land and the mitzvahs, and then the Hasidic world healing that rift between different groups and leaders. So that's where we reached the end of tonight's shiur. And I hope there's some things that we can take away. But Rabbi Nachman, he risked everything because he believed in the Jewish people, and he could believe that they could be one, and he also believed in ourselves, and he paved the way to Israel, not only for himself, but also for later generations to come. And he believed that our mitzvahs matter, and he wanted to show that by achieving what he could to accomplish those mitzvahs in the land of Israel. And he believed that clarity was worth traveling for and taking those first steps in order to be able to achieve our goals. And we merit to be able to achieve that, and with every step we take to bring us closer to the Gula. There you go. Okay.